welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Kristen Baskett, the Director of Product Marketing here at Power DMS. And today we're talking about something that every public safety organization is dealing with right now, which is how to hire the right people, not just the most qualified on paper, but the people who are going to represent your agency in the right way. So I'm really excited to be joined today by Robert Weck. Robert spent 31 years in law enforcement, including the last 10 years as chief of police in Summit, New Jersey. Over his career, he supervised every bureau in the department and led hiring across the organization. Bob, thanks so much for being here.
Really appreciate it. Glad to be part of the conversation.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and start here. You've hired across every level, from entry-level officers to leadership roles. When you look at hiring today, what do you think agencies are still getting wrong?
I think the biggest challenge is that we still tend to focus heavily on the skills, the experience, and the credentials. And while those things matter, and they do, but I really think over time is that they don't tell you how someone is going to perform when it really counts. And it doesn't also tell you how they're going to make decisions under pressure and how they're going to treat people. And most importantly, how are they going to represent your department? And what really makes that difference is the values. And that's where I really think we have an opportunity to be more intentional about how we evaluate that in the hiring process.
Awesome. Well, obviously, that's a really great place to start. Organizations like the International Association of Chief of Police talk about how values just like integrity and accountability need to be defined in observable behavioral terms, not just listed out. So, from your experience, what happens when agencies don't take the time to do that first step?
I think it all comes down to one word: inconsistency. Everyone agrees that integrity matters as well as accountability matters, and especially in the public safety sector. But you don't define what that looks like in the job, people are going to interpret them differently. And in policing, that can be a problem. You need to be able to say, this is what integrity looks like on a call. This is what accountability looks like when something doesn't go as planned. And in the public safety world, unfortunately, those things do happen a lot. So I think then you're relying on individual judgment instead of those shared standards. And that's going to show up in hiring too. So if your interview panel doesn't have a clear shared definition of what you're looking for, then each person in the room is evaluating candidates a little differently. And that makes it a little harder to make consistent decision. So once we just started like defining values in more practical terms, what does this look like on a call? How does this show up during a shift? It kind of aligned everything a little better, and it made hiring better, and it made the supervision clearer, which is critical in our line of work.
Awesome. So instead of these abstract values, what you're really wanting to translate that into is what someone is actually doing.
100%. Because if you can't describe in the field, you're really going to struggle to hire for it.
Awesome. So let's move on to the next topic and build on that a little bit. So the Police Executive Research Forum recommends using scenario-based and experience-based interviewing to evaluate things, as we talked about, like judgment, like ethics, like decision making. How did that show up for you in your hiring process?
I think one of the changes we've kind of made, we started shifting away from the hypotheticals because we found like when you ask someone what they would do, you're going to get a really well prepared answer because they're joining exam prep classes, they're talking to seasoned professionals to ask them what would they say or what did they say in these interviews. And so they're getting ready for the interviews. And because of that, they come in, they have a really well prepared answer and they do really well. But I think most of the time is they're telling us what they think we want to hear. So we wanted to get away from that. So we started focusing on what have they actually done? And we started asking questions like, candidate, tell me about a time you had to make a decision and you didn't have all the information. Or tell me about a situation that definitely did not go as planned and how did you handle it? And then we would sit back and we would kind of listen and not just for the answer to the question, but how they approached it. We wanted to know, like, did they take ownership? Did they communicate effectively? And really importantly, did they learn from it? And because of that, you start to hear patterns. And those patterns are much more predictive of how someone's going to perform than just, the prepared answer that they gave us.
And I imagine it's probably a lot more honest of a picture too than you'd get with the pre-prepared responses.
It really is because you start to see the foundation of the person, not just the answer that they're giving. And and sometimes I found that the best answer, it isn't always the perfect situation, and they're the ones where something went wrong, and the person then can clearly explain how they handled it and what they learned, and that tells us about their mindset.
Our next topic is all about pressure. Law enforcement organizations talk a lot about decision making and ethical judgment under pressure as being a core competency in law enforcement. So, Robert, why is pressure such an important factor when you are evaluating candidates?
I think in the public sector world, that's the environment we operate in. It's all about pressure because you're not making decisions with perfect information and you're not always getting time to think everything through. And sometimes you literally have seconds to make a decision and then act. And there's pressure, there's uncertainty, and there's impact behind what you do. And that's when the value really starts to show up because you can train someone on procedures and you can train someone on policy, but how they apply it under pressure, that's going to come down to judgment and values. So in interviews, I always wanted candidates to walk me through how they think in those situations. Like, what are they considering? How do they prioritize? How do they balance safety, communication, and decision making? Because that's what's going to translate to the field. Because we're not just hiring for knowledge. I want to hire someone and like that knows how to operate when it really matters and when that pressure's on.
Definitely. So it's less about getting the right answer and more about understanding what that thought process is.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Two people can definitely make different decisions, but how they arrive at those decisions, that kind of tells me if they're aligned with our standards.
So now I want to talk a little bit about structure and specifically structure in the hiring process itself. Law enforcement organizations emphasize that structured interviews, consistent questions, and consistent scoring all help reduce bias and improve fairness. So, Robert, what did this kind of structure look like in your department?
As you can imagine, the hiring process is so key. It's kind of like building the strong foundation of a house, right? You want to get it right. So we treated hiring as a disciplined process. We used consistent questions, and we try to tie those to the values and behaviors that we were looking for as a department. We had a structured way to evaluate responses because without that, we kind of felt that it's easy for hiring decisions to then be based on impressions, and impressions can vary a lot depending on who's in the room. So in the past, before I became chief, it was basically the chief, the deputy, maybe a lieutenant or two was in the interview process, and I wanted a panel that had different perspectives. So I had a patrol officer, a sergeant, two lieutenants, two captains, and myself in that panel because I felt that structure that's what's going to bring all those perspectives together, and it ensured that everyone is evaluating the candidates against the same criteria, and that made our decisions more consistent and definitely more defensible.
And it also sounds like it reinforces that culture of hiring being a shared responsibility.
It really does because no one person is making that decision, or nor should they, because the team needs to all be collectively on board with that hiring process and picking that candidate. So the structure helps you get there.
Excellent. All right. So the final area that I wanted to touch on here is consistency. CALIA standards emphasize that values should show up across recruitment, selection, and training, not just on interview day. So, in your experience, Robert, how important is that alignment?
I think it's so critical. Um, Having that one message, because if your recruiting message says one thing, and then your interview process says something totally different, and then your training reinforces something different, all you're doing is creating confusion, and the candidates are going to pick up on that. So we worked really hard to make sure everything aligned from the first interaction we had with the candidate to the first day in training. we wanted the expectations all to be consistent. And the three that we wanted were, this is who we are, this is what we expect, and this is how we operate. And that clarity matters. It helps the right people move forward with confidence, and it helps everybody recognize early on if it's the right fit.
So consistency, it's not just an internal thing, it actually shapes who chooses your organization as well.
100%, because it's not just us picking the candidate, they're selecting us as well.
Awesome. Bob, this has been incredibly valuable. If you had to leave agencies with just one piece of advice when it comes to hiring for values, what would it be?
I think to think a little outside the box and not, do it just because that's the way we've always done it. Be intentional about what you're really evaluating. It is easy to focus on the qualification and the certificates that they have and the experience they have, and yes, those are all important. But over time, I think really what's going to determine success is how someone applies those skills every day. How do they make decisions? How they treat people, and very important, how do they represent, your organization? And I think all that comes back to values. And if you take the time to define those values clearly, then evaluate them consistently, and then reinforce them throughout your process, I think you're going to build a stronger team. And ultimately, that's going to, lead to a better outcome for your organization and definitely for the community that you're serving.
Awesome. I think that that is an excellent note to end on. Robert, thank you again for sharing your experience and your perspective. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We are now going to transition into our Q&A. So I do have some great questions here in the chat as we're going through. You can feel free to add additional ones. We will get to as many questions as we have time for today. And if we don't get to your question in this session, rest assured we will be following up via email and make sure every question that you have for me and Robert is answered. So, Robert, let's go ahead and start our Q&A.
Great, looking forward to it.
All right, first question I have here in the chat is, how do you actually evaluate values like integrity or accountability during hiring?
I think, one of the questions we always asked was, tell us about a time that your integrity was questioned. And we don't want to just hear the answer. Someone accused me of stealing once when I worked at a five and dime, store when I was younger. But we want to learn about the whole process, how they handled, being accused, if that was the case, and how do they turn a negative into a positive. A lot of it is just how they answer the question. That's what we're looking for.
Excellent. Second question here I have is, what is the biggest mistake that you've seen agencies make in the hiring process?
I think not taking their time. I think a lot of times people do look great on paper, and I've seen it. I've seen where departments have hired someone because of the experience, the credentials, the things we just talked about earlier, and they hire on that, and they didn't do a deep dive on the values and the integrity, and ask the right questions. And sometimes that comes back where it finds out they're not a good fit for the department, or the department's not a good fit for them. And I really think you have to take your time when you're hiring someone, because they're going to be on your job for at least 25 years. And you want to make sure that the little things don't become big things, especially, when it comes to liability.
Definitely. Can you give me an idea of how AI is potentially making this worse? I see a lot of, in my own hiring, really AI heavily written resumes that I get across my desk.
Um, AI is definitely new, and this, next generation of being hired, they've grown up being on their phone, ordering food, a car, just doing everything, applying for a job. Everything is done on the phone now, and obviously, AI is really taking a big part of that. And again, what I just mentioned in the last question is, on paper they look great. So I think it's really important to have that one-on-one. And you could even ask them, like, look, we really loved your opening letter that you sent us. Could you just like tell us about that a little bit more? And yes, it's a little bit of pressure. It's going to check their integrity, how well they respond, just like what we talked about earlier today about how they respond under pressure and something didn't go right. So AI is a huge thing now, and I think that the hiring process just has to be a little smarter because again, it comes down to how are they going to represent your department because they're not going to have AI, when they're on a call talking with somebody. So you want to see how are they going to interact with people? Because to me, no matter if it's a really low priority call or a really, really high priority call, you have to treat the people. It's the most important call of your day right then. And that's, with empathy and compassion and everything else, I think that really goes a long way. I know it did for my department. We were very big in that, in the community policing part of that.
All right, I think we have time for just two more questions. So, next question for you, Robert, is how do you assess decision making under pressure during an interview?
Well, like I mentioned, walking in and seeing eight uniformed individuals sitting across the stage, kind of looking down on you, that's the first taste of pressure they're going to get. And right then, we're already starting to evaluate. How did they react to that? Um, and so, reacting to pressure, again, you have a split second. Is a cell phone a handgun? When it's coming out of the pocket. And, a lot of that just comes to training. I've coached lacrosse and football my whole life, and I've always said, you practice like you play and you play like you practice. Because if you go all out in practice, you're going to go all out in the game, and your body is going to react to how you did that in practice. And, law enforcement and fire and EMS, public safety world is no different. You have to train so that when it happens, it's instinct. You're going to take that quick second to really register what is that, coming out of the pocket and things like that. So I really think with pressure, you really never know how anybody's going to act under pressure, and you hope it's the right way. But if you trained for it, I think more than not, you're going to get the correct action.
Excellent. And then, last question I have for you today. How do you connect hiring decisions to long term performance in the field?
Good question. It's a little tough because I've seen some candidates that we've hired that were good candidates and then became great candidates and became great officers over the years. They really absorbed the training. They really got along with the community. And then I've also seen where we had some really, really strong candidates on paper in the hiring process, in the beginning of the training, the academy, and then over time, a little too soon, they became a little jaded, and that became an issue. And then we had to obviously retrain and make sure everything was going home outside their career to that they weren't bringing something to work that could affect not only them but the community, and definitely in a liability role because I don't think any department wants to write a check with a lot of zeros. So I've kind of seen it both, but if you do the hard work in the beginning, more than not, you're going to get that officer that's going to be there for the long run and is going to be a positive interaction for the whole community and the department.
Robert, thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation. For everyone here on the webinar, we appreciate you. If we didn't get to your questions that are in the chat, we will be following up on those after the broadcast. So thanks, y'all, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.